A black man gets trapped in the house of a racist white family. Will he be able to get out from this sinister place? Curious about the story? Tune in for the recap. Today, I'll share the recap of a horrifying film, Get Out. But before we begin, a quick disclaimer: spoilers ahead. The movie begins with Andre, a black man, strolling through a calm neighborhood. He's approached by a suspicious white car, which makes him anxious. He attempts to walk away but suddenly notices the car door is open. Unexpectedly, the driver swiftly hits him, rendering him unconscious, and pulls him into the car. We're then introduced to our protagonist, Chris Washington, an African-American photographer, who's finishing up packing. His white girlfriend, Rose Armitage, arrives at his door, ready to take him to meet her parents. Chris, feeling uneasy, inquires if her parents are aware of his race, concerned about potential racism. Rose reassures him that her parents don't hold any such hatred. During their journey, Chris contacts his close friend Rod, an airport security officer, to express gratitude for looking after his dog during the trip. Suddenly, a leaping deer collides with their windshield, shocking them both. Stepping out of the car, they discover a broken rearview mirror, and Chris locates the dying deer near the woods. They opt to inform the police, but during the interaction, the officer demands Chris' ID without apparent cause. This unjustified request infuriates Rose, as Chris wasn't even the driver, leading her to rebuke the biased cop. The two then resume their journey, until they finally arrive at Rose's parents' residence. It is clear that Rose's parents are well off. Her father, Dean Armitage, is a neurosurgeon, and her mother, Missy, works as a psychiatrist. During their visit, Dean shows Chris around the house. Chris notices the black groundskeeper and housekeeper, which makes him uncomfortable. Dean explains that they were caretakers for his parents and he kept them on after their passing. Later, they all gather on the porch for a conversation. The parents reveal plans for a house party the next day. During this discussion, Chris opens up about losing his mother when he was young due to a car accident. Sensing the sensitivity of the topic, the parents shift to discussing Chris's smoking habits, which they've noticed earlier. Dean suggests Missy's hypnosis therapy as a means to quit his smoking habit. He was now in doctor's house and according to them, cigarette smoking causes lung cancer and sh*t. But hey, let's get on with the recap, shall we? While they talk, the housekeeper Georgina brings them tea, but her behavior seems strange, showing both happiness and stress. Missy abruptly sends her away. Just as Chris's reaction is about to be shown, Rose's younger brother Jeremy arrives home from med school, interrupting them. This whole family is a bunch of medical junkies. During dinner, Jeremy, intoxicated by alcohol, tells a funny story about Rose from high school. The housekeeper acts oddly in the background. Then, things turn tense as Jeremy asks Chris about his fighting skills, mentioning genetic differences between races. Jeremy even tries to start a fight, but the parents stop it. When Rose and Chris have some privacy in her room, she shows her frustration about her family's strange and racist behavior during the day. She apologizes to Chris, admitting that she didn't anticipate her family to act that way. Later that night, Chris struggles to sleep, so he goes outside for a smoke. Suddenly, he sees the groundskeeper, Walter, running directly at him, but Walter runs past without a word. When Chris looks back, he sees the housekeeper, Georgina, gazing at her reflection in the window, seemingly unaware of him. When Chris re-enters the house, he finds Missy having tea in the therapy room and decides to join her. Here, Missy starts questioning him about his smoking habit and suggests trying the therapy. While she stirs the tea, the scraping sound appears to affect Chris. She then delves into intrusive queries about the time of his mother's death. Despite his hesitance, the noise of the tea stirring strangely compels Chris to respond. Missy persistently asks about this painful memory, and gradually, he begins to cry and eventually feels paralyzed. As a finishing touch, Missy says a single word, sink. Instantly, Chris experiences an involuntary sensation of sinking into his mind. He struggles to resist this feeling, but he's powerless. Missy names this state the sunken place, where his awareness disconnects from his body. The following moment, he awakens in Rose's bed, greeted by a text from his friend Rod. He tells him the events of the previous night as a bad dream. He finds that his battery is low so he plugs it in. That day, he chooses to explore and photograph the surroundings. He approaches Walter, the groundskeeper, and attempts a conversation. Walter appears strange, his eyes seem distant, and his speech resembles that of a white person from the 1950s. He brings up Chris's smoking habit and inquires about the therapy with Missy the previous night, revealing that the nightmare wasn't just a dream. Chris promptly tells his girlfriend about the hypnotic experience, leading her to apologize for her mother's actions. He also realizes that the hypnosis worked, as he no longer has a craving to smoke. Right after this, they watch, through the window, a crowd of white guests arriving for the Armitages' annual event. The older guests act strangely around Chris. One man asks if Chris is good at golf like Tiger Woods. A woman inquires if Chris is better in bed because he's black. Another couple remarks that black skin is trendy, making Chris uncomfortable, so he walks away. He decides to find a good spot for photography. While doing so, he comes across another black man named Logan King at the party. Like Walter, Logan behaves and speaks like an elderly white person. Logan's considerably older wife approaches him and informs him that someone wants to talk to him. As Logan leaves, Chris is further surprised by Logan's unfamiliarity with a simple fist bump gesture. Later, Chris encounters a blind man named Jim Hudson at the gathering. Chris recognizes him as a renowned art curator who lost his sight due to a genetic condition. Unlike the others who bring up Chris's race, Jim appreciates Chris's work and praises his photography skills. As Chris tires of socializing at the party, he goes upstairs, while everyone at the event unexpectedly falls silent and looks upwards. He goes back to Rose's room and notices his phone charger has been unplugged, even though he remembers charging his phone earlier. He becomes suspicious and checks another room, where he finds Georgina. He deduces that she must have unplugged his phone. Chris informs Rose about this, but she doesn't think the housekeeper intended any harm by it. Chris calls Rod and updates him about Rose's mother using hypnosis to help him quit smoking. Rod finds this freaky and mentions that white people love making people sex slaves. Georgina interrupts and Chris asks her about feeling uneasy among so many white people. Georgina appears like she wants to say something, but starts crying and mentions the Armitages treat her like family before leaving oddly. Returning downstairs, Chris sees Dean conversing with a group of elderly individuals. One of them questions whether being African American is advantageous or disadvantageous these days. Chris seizes the chance to involve Logan, hoping to get an answer. While covertly taking a photo to show Rod, he accidentally leaves the flash on. The flash causes Logan to have a nosebleed, and he reacts frantically, yelling at Chris to get out. Logan is taken away, and Dean later explains that Logan is epileptic, and the camera flash triggered his reaction. Logan emerges from Missy's therapy room, announcing that he feels better and intends to leave with his wife to rest. To lift spirits, Dean suggests a party game, but Rose notices Chris's downcast expression and takes him for a walk. During their absence, the family and guests conduct a bizarre auction with Chris as the prize, and the blind Jim Hudson becomes the highest bidder. Meanwhile, in the woods, Chris tells Rose that he is feeling strange since the hypnosis and tells her that he somewhat knows Logan. He also expresses a desire to go home, and Rose agrees, planning to leave for the city the next morning. As they return to the house, the sky is dark, and the remaining guests are leaving in their cars. Alone in Rose's room, Chris sends the photo of Logan to his friend Rod. Rod recognizes the man as Andre Hayworth, who once dated someone they knew. Rod becomes anxious when Chris mentions that Andre changed his name and is now with an elderly woman. Unfortunately, Chris's phone battery dies before they can continue the conversation. Recognizing that something is seriously wrong, Chris tells Rose that they need to leave immediately. Although Rose agrees, she has to fetch her bag first. While she's gone, the open closet captures Chris's curiosity, prompting him to investigate. There, he stumbles upon multiple photos of Rose with other black men in past relationships. Shockingly, the photos also include Walter and Georgina. It becomes apparent that Chris isn't the first black man that Rose has been involved with. In a sudden turn of events, Rose reappears, claiming readiness to leave but unable to find her car keys. Chris presses her to head downstairs. Unfortunately, Jeremy stands there blocking the door, while Missy waits in the foyer with her tea. Chris appeals to Rose for the keys. Dean enters, discussing the brilliance of the white mind. Chris grows impatient, and loudly demands the keys. Playfully, Jeremy wields a lacrosse stick, while Missy and Dean close in. Rose confesses her role in the family's scheme. Chris attacks Jeremy, and Missy taps her teacup, placing Chris under hypnosis again. Helplessly, Chris watches as the family escorts him to the basement. Back in the city, Rod's concern grows. He attempts to reach Chris through multiple calls, but there's no response. That night, he conducts a Google search on Andre and stumbles upon a missing person article about him. Returning to Chris, he awakens to find himself bound to a chair. He attempts to break free, but in vain. The TV in front of him switches on, showing a video of a white man, Rose's grandfather, who explains that Chris was selected due to his genetic advantage as a black man. Next, the recording of tea being stirred plays, causing Chris to lose consciousness once more. The following day, Rod visits the police to report his suspicion that his friend Chris is held captive by a white family. He explains their alleged practice of kidnapping black people as sex slaves, but the police dismiss him, responding with laughter. Rod's determination remains unshaken. He attempts to call Chris's phone again, but this time, Rose answers. She adopts a perplexed tone, stating that Chris left suddenly in a cab 2 days ago. Despite her attempt to deceive, Rod sees through her falsehoods. As Rod starts recording the call, Rose employs manipulation, shifting the conversation by saying that she knows how badly Rod wants to bang her, which weirds him out and gets him to hang up. As this unfolds, Chris regains consciousness in the basement and sees blind John Hudson on the TV. John calmly reveals a surgical plan to transplant his brain into Chris's body. This procedure would result in Chris's consciousness lingering while he becomes a passenger in his own body, trapped in the sunken place. Chris learns that Rose's family has been transplanting elderly white individuals' consciousness into young black bodies, providing them with desired physical attributes and a distorted kind of immortality. In John's instance, he covets Chris's eyes above all else. After the call concludes, Chris spots cotton sticking out of his armrest. Just before the T recording starts, anticipating another blackout, Chris prepares himself to lose consciousness. Meanwhile, in an adjacent room, Dean initiates the brain transplant procedure, while Jeremy heads to fetch Chris. After unfastening the chair's restraints, Jeremy readies in 4. Seizing an opportunity, Chris strikes Jeremy with a lacrosse ball. Actually, Chris protected himself from hypnosis by plugging his ears with the cotton from the armrest of the chair. Observing the mounted deer on the wall, Chris devises a plan. With Jeremy's absence prolonged, Dean goes outside in search of him. Taking advantage of the situation, Chris confronts Dean, thrusting the deer horns into him, resulting in fatal bleeding. Amidst the turmoil, Dean wickedly topples a candle, sparking a fire that engulfs the operating room where Jim Hudson lies anesthetized. Subsequently, Chris ascends the stairs, encountering the mother. He acts swiftly, knocking the teacup off the table before she can reach it. In response, she wields a sharp object and stabs his palm. Amidst their intense struggle, Chris gains the upper hand, overpowering her and ultimately stabbing her in the eye. Chris reaches the front door, where an injured Jeremy appears and traps him in a headlock, hindering his door reach. Chris stabs Jeremy in the shin and then hits on his head and kills him. Meanwhile, Rose is upstairs, occupied with music and browsing shirtless images of black men. Chris retrieves the car keys, starts Rose's car, and accidentally collides with Georgina as he drives away. Moved by compassion due to his own mother's hit-and-run tragedy, he brings Georgina into the car. Unfortunately, Rose hears the crash and rushes outside with a rifle, yelling, "Grandma." It becomes apparent that Georgina's body houses her grandmother's consciousness. Georgina awakens and assaults Chris, driven by rage over her family's demise. This results in a car crash that claims Georgina's life, while Chris survives. Top of form. Following the car crash, Chris stumbles out of the car, narrowly dodging Rose's gunshot. Unexpectedly, Walter, the groundskeeper, charges towards Chris under Rose's command, "Get him, Grandpa." Walter pins Chris down, but Chris swiftly uses the flash camera to snap a picture of him, awakening the real person within. Walter requests Rose's rifle, aiming to eliminate Chris, but he shoots Rose in the abdomen instead. Subsequently, he points the rifle at himself, ending his own life. Later, Chris approaches Rose, choking her in anger but unable to end her life. In a sudden turn of events, a police car arrives, and Rose calls for help. Fortunately, it's an airport security car belonging to Chris's best friend, Rod. Chris and Rod quietly enter the car, driving away and leaving Rose to bleed to death in the street. What are your thoughts on this movie? Share in the comments section below. If you enjoyed the content, remember to give it a thumbs up, share, and subscribe. Until next time, take care, and stay tuned for more videos.